Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back, finally, to some more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to talk about Nurgle's rot. Because it seems a fitting subject, considering the personal events of the last couple of weeks, where I managed to get myself a good old dose of the Chinese blessings, and a far more aggressive strain, apparently, than last time I had it. I only had about a week of proper fever, sitting in front of my computer, covered in blankets, shivering, but it just didn't want to leave the system and was messing up my voice quite ferociously. But we are finally over it now, so it's back to work yet again. So, Nurgle's rot. What makes this so special compared to all of the other thousands of diseases the grandfather has concocted in his little hut in the realms of chaos over the years? Because, remember, as we briefly talked about in another video, this is all Nurgle does, more or less. He sits around his little hut, and he tries to concoct ever more virulent and horrific diseases to unleash upon the living world, testing them on the Eldar goddess Isha to see if the effects are suitably horrific. Unfortunately for our great glorious grandfather, the vast majority of his creations are deemed unsatisfactory, and are simply hurled out of a window to hiss and pop and disappear into the fetid air of Nurgle's gardens. Whilst yet other recipes that are deemed suitably terrifying are undermined by Nurgle's favourite guinea pig, as Isha has not lost all of her power. She is still able to communicate in very limited fashion, primarily via dreams or visions with the mortal world. And since she herself is capable of curing any disease that affects her given enough time, she is also able to figure out the literal cure to these plagues. And so when Nurgle infects her and he finds the disease to be effective enough and begins spreading it in the real world, Isha can contact physicians, medical doctors, researchers, or witch doctors and shamans. Whatever form of medical professional is readily available on the world that Nurgle has chosen to bless today. This in turn means that many of Nurgle's more innovative diseases will die in their infancy, simply be wiped out almost immediately by a flash of inspiration, creating a vaccine or a easily teachable yet effective form of treatment. And of course Nurgle knows this. Obviously, Nurgle knows this. One minute he's testing his brand new toxin on his pet Eldar goddess, and the next it's cured almost instantly by some backwater shaman on a third-rate Imperial world who suddenly figures that, oh, if I rub a bird's asshole on the infected areas, then voila, everything's fixed. Nurgle is not a complete idiot, but Isha is far too important to him to get rid of over such minor inconveniences, and hell, it's just a challenge, isn't it? And besides, if his brand new disease can be so easily cured, was it really a worthy one in the first place? Nah. So, back to the drawing board then. Or the pot, more correctly in this case, as all of Nurgle's creations are concocted in an enormous and undoubtedly extraordinarily filthy and infectious pot. It is from this crusty cauldron that all of Nurgle's creations emerge, including his finest one ever, Nurgle's rot. Nurgle has never managed to create a disease quite like it, nor, probably, is he likely to, because I imagine that he views Nurgle's rot actually as a little bit of cheating, frankly. Because it is not really actually a genuine plague or pestilence or disease or infection. It is not a virus, nor is it a bacteria. Rather, it is a form of demonic infestation. One could therefore even make a fairly persuasive argument that the reason why Nurgle hasn't created a disease like it might not have to do anything with fair play, though, I don't know. Nurgle strikes me like the kind of chaos god who would, at least to an extent, care about that, because, after all, he could simply just continue to create nothing but Nurgle's rot and infest the entirety of the living universe. But he doesn't. Instead, he continuously experiments and tries and toys around with all manners of different infections, probably because he enjoys the challenge. He views the creation of new diseases and the eventual curing of them as a competition between himself and, well, the living world, between him and the doctors, etc., etc. But, wandering off the point, one could argue that Nurgle's rot is not actually a disease at all, and may not in fact have been created by Nurgle, at the very least not in the pot-storing fashion, but instead that Nurgle's rot is simply an aspect of Nurgle. It is a part of him. Nurgle's rot exists because Nurgle exists. He didn't create it, he didn't plan it, but it exists because of him, and only because of him. And since the disease, quote-unquote, is essentially a demonic infestation, it is not bound by any of the usual laws of, well, any sickness at all. In fact, it can not only produce virtually every single symptom imaginable, it can even create symptoms that just straight up should not be physically possible. A couple of the examples given, for example, in the various source books, is making the victim's eyes swim together in one single enormous orb, or creating pustules that is filled not with pus or blood or anything, but rather with living, wriggling worms. I hardly need to tell you, but the human body's not really set up to produce living worms, no matter how sick it might get. But even more important than the physical symptoms is the effect that Nurgle rot has on the psyche. Because Nurgle rot, again, it's so much more than a simple disease. The actual physical symptoms are there to cause discomfort, to cause pain, to cause terror, to cause the victim to begin losing all hope, as it is far more an attack on the psyche than it is on the physical body. In fact, Nurgle rot is practically specifically designed to not kill the host, or at the very least, not kill them quickly. This is in part, again, because of the supernatural elements of it. Whenever a host is infected by Nurgle's rot, a fruit begins to grow in Nurgle's garden. This fruit feasts on the pain and suffering and ails of the host. And the longer that the sickness manages to keep the host, or victim perhaps more appropriately, in a state of suffering and agony, the larger the fruit grows. In most cases, it will burst open upon the death of the victim to create a single plague-bearer demon. But not just any plague-bearer demon. This is not a, demon in the most traditional sense, in that it is a pure manifestation of the warp. Instead, it appears to somehow be possessed of the mind and body and soul of the victim, almost as if their essence has been transported into the warp somehow, and then corrupted into a demon of Nurgle. Now, the plague bearers are not particularly complicated demons, nor do they have much, if any, real sense of self, so you wouldn't even really be able to tell the difference. But if the disease is allowed, quote-unquote, to continue going for long enough, to drag the victim down into the deepest pits of despair and suffering, then a herald of Nurgle is created rather than a regular plague bearer. Now, these heralds are far more complex demons than the regular run-of-the-mill lesser demons like the plague bearers. They are possessed of a sense of self. They remember their time as mortals. Some of them even feel a bit of shame or confusion at the idea that they would reject the grandfather's blessings for so very long as to be allowed to turn into a herald. And some, controversially, see it as a reward, in that even in their fleshy and unenlightened form, they understood that if they could hold out for longer, they could take more of the grandfather's blessing within themselves, and so transform more fully. This also, incidentally, is one of the reasons why I imagine that Nurgle probably doesn't view Nurgle's rot necessarily as one of his actual diseases. Instead, I imagine he views it more as a particular gift and or blessing. Now, of course, all diseases are blessings from the grandfather. They are all opportunities to learn of his true glory. But something that transforms a person into an actual demon, essentially granting them a form of immortality, well, that's quite a few steps further down the line again. And considering there are mortal champions of Nurgle that spend their entire lives praying for his blessing, praying for the blessing of immortality and demonhood, and never receive it, yeah, no, I imagine he does view this as a rather special gift. Though he wouldn't be the Great Grandfather if he wasn't very generous in its delivery, or spreading more correctly, as Nurgle's rot will spread by simple touch. Anyone even nearby or in the vicinity of an area infected by the rot is likely to soon experience its effects personally. This is also why, whenever an infestation is actually noticed, rather extreme measures are taken rather quickly. There are those who believe that there are cures for Nurgle's rot, though not medical cures, mind you. There is an interesting passage in the Liber Poetica, for example, which talk about an attempt to cure an example of Nurgle's rot, where they talk about it more as a suffering of the mind, again, rather than a physical corruption. And so ointments and unguents and herbal essences and brews, etc., don't really work. Instead, this is a magical disease that must be dispelled by magical means. Alternatively, the victim's spirits must be raised to such a point where they themselves are able to fight off the disease. Because again, it isn't an actual sickness, it is Nurgle's gift. It is his gift of despair. And the moment you will finally, willingly give in to that despair, you will be saved from all of it. Nurgle will remove all of your pain, all of your suffering, and all of your ill tempers. This is why the little plague bearers constantly laugh and giggle and dance around. Because as far as they're concerned, well, all of the bad things have been taken away from them. The Great Grandfather has relieved them of all their sorrows. Now, sadly, most people, almost all in fact, will never be cured of Nurgle's rot because, well, it's far easier to give in to despair, particularly when you are infected by a god disease, mind you. Like, you can't really condemn the poor bastards too strictly now, can you? Your eyeballs are beginning to transform into gelatinous little flesh-eating monsters that are eating their way into your brain. Giving in to despair starts to sound like a pretty good deal at that point. Alternatively, a bolt pistol round between the eyes is also another cure, because Whilst, of course, again, we've mentioned that the only real cure for Nurgle's rot is that the person that is infected with it throws it off via a strong will, and via the help of those around him, of course. It's far easier to be strong if you are kept comfortable and fed and etc, etc. But the other cure, the more Inquisition-style cure, is a quick bullet to the back of the head. Unlike the other forms of treatment, this one has a 100% success rate. Well, so long as you adopt a rather broad definition of the word cure, that is, of course. But for once, even these rather extreme measures, well, they are difficult to fully condemn, aren't they? You are dealing with a disease that has basically no actual true surefire cure, that is spread via simple touch, that can infest entire communities. In fact, Nurgle's rot had been mentioned to literally be able to infect the environment in the area, not merely infecting the people, but being able to turn the air fetid and thick, being able to make sunlight look less bright and appealing, less inviting, being able to rot wood and the physical things around you. Like, that's the kind of disease we're talking about here. Maybe the good old-fashioned Prometheum cure is the best one for everyone involved. Because when this stuff starts to spread, there really is no stopping it. Now, there are a couple of variations on this, mind you. In 40k, Nurgle's rot is essentially described as so infectious that once it begins, you've got to level everything. You've got to destroy entire communities. You've got to go full scorched earth for an area of dozens of square kilometers in any direction to make sure. Whereas in Warhammer Fantasy, there is a similar plague, Nurglit's rot, which is Nurgle's rot by another name, as Warhammer and 40k, of course, share the same gods, and therefore it is reasonable to assume they share the same disease as well. But in this case, the disease is nowhere near as infectious, or at the very least, there are countermeasures against it, possibly due to the fact that the world of Warhammer Fantasy recognizes the value and the power of magic. Therefore, organizations like the Sisters of Mercy or the Sisters of Sigmar, who are traditionally engaged in a great deal of healing work, can actually put up wards to protect themselves against the disease. They can actually contain it because they recognize it for what it is, a demonic disease. They understand that it is magic, and they fight magic with more magic. It would in fact be rather interesting if you had a psyker in 40k try to counter the disease. If he literally did treat the disease as a hive of microscopic demons and attacked it on that basis, would a psyker be able to essentially burn out Nurgle's rot? Would a blank be immune to Nurgle's rot? Would a blank simply by being near to a victim be able to cure it and drive it out entirely? That's an interesting question. One that I don't believe has been answered in the fluff, at least not that I can recall reading about. But again, there is the interesting little thing also that Nurgle's rot, as I mentioned, is absolutely a demonic disease, but we don't know exactly how much. Because of course there are degrees of this as well. It isn't necessarily that these are literal tiny little miniature demons, although in Warhammer they are described as such, in fantasy that is. So perhaps it is simply just an aggravation of other forms of disease. Maybe it takes a sickness like the bubonic plague, to take an example, infests the host with it via, warp fuckery, and then enhances it, again via warp fuckery. But even if you were to drive away the warp fuckery, the bubonic plague would still be there, because that is still a regular old disease, merely enhanced by the Nurgle's rot. An interesting theory. Especially, again, considering the link between the host and the fruit growing in the gardens of Nurgle. Actually, looping back to the blank idea, surely a blank would sever the connection between the host and that fruit, therefore killing the plague-bearer and presumably ending the disease. Maybe there is a cure for Nurgle's rot after all. All you've got to do is bring the victims to a blank, one of the rarest individuals in the entire galaxy. Oh well, I mean, it is a theoretical cure, if nothing else. Granted, if it backfires though, you'll now have a psychic blank infected with Nurgle's rot, which I imagine would create quite the fascinating little plague-bearer. Perhaps it would actually create a plague-bearer free of Nurgle's rot. A healthy plague-bearer. Now that would be a sight to behold, now wouldn't it? Anywho, with that, I hope you have a little bit better of an idea of what Nurgle's rot is, and, more importantly, what it isn't. And I also hope you now have a mental image of a perfectly healthy plague-bearer in your mind. Rosy cheeks and all. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.